So sustainability means many different things to many different types of people. But in many cases, the solution boils down to the 3 R's: reduce, reuse, recycle. What Materials Nexus is doing is to invent the 4th R, what we call re-engineer. And we are re-engineering many products around the world economy in order to accelerate the transition towards net zero materials. And so, where this problem comes from is that it takes an extremely long time and extremely lot of money to invent new materials which are more optimized than previous examples. And this means that corporates in most cases don't engage with this particular system and is left down to, in most cases, universities. In the same way, this is true for the drug discovery industry, where it takes an awful lot of money to take new drugs to market. We are accelerating that process. One of the reasons as to why it's really slow is that the process for development of new materials relies on a trial and error process, which means that you may make many examples of a given device or material before you actually get to success. And this is epitomized by Thomas Edison, who famously said that it took him 10,000 ways to successfully invent the light bulb. And so what is our solution? Our solution is a range of different technologies which we've combined in order to accelerate the whole end-to-end materials discovery and optimization process. And this ranges from artificial intelligence technologies, which enables you to predict material properties and find and screen different combinations. This is very valuable because you can remove certain materials which may come from conflict zones, and so therefore enhancing supply chain security. And it enables you to increase product performance, so you can potentially lightweight further electric vehicles, which means that you can get more range, or if it's an internal combustion engine, less emissions from the less weight. After we've performed this screening, we then perform a limited number of laboratory tests. We can then file intellectual property and then move towards licensing of manufacturing. And so, our ambition when compared to the status quo is to do this whole process in 2 years as opposed to 20 years. The team comprises myself. I've got over 10 years experience in the field of materials science, along with advising a number of startups, including as a role of CFO. I've also helped out on the Royal Mechanical Engineering program, the LIFT program, and a number of other programs from the Judge Business School in Cambridge. There's Robert Forrest, who has won numerous awards in programming and has a master's in scientific computing from Cambridge, and successfully been awarded a number of projects from the research point of view. John Pillau, he's got over 45 patents to his name and is very experienced in the materials domain and has been involved as principal scientist in a number of UK materials-based companies. And finally, Nick Sturck, MBE, has a commercial acumen which backs up the scientific team in order to enable us to sell our product and to find the customers. He's also a fellow of the Institute of Directors and graduate of Stanford. In terms of our traction to date, we've successfully raised from a number of accelerators and angel investors. We have done a number of other sort of rounds in the sort of recent days, and so we've got some money on the table there. We've also, last week, we participated in a UK government trade mission to Sweden, where we got the opportunity to visit lots of the different aerospace companies in Sweden, which was an amazing opportunity to work out where we can potentially use this technology to aid electric flight and hydrogen flight. We've received some money from the government, from the Department for Transport, and this enables us to actually start to create more intellectual property and demonstrators from our technology. And finally, we've secured POCs with some of the biggest companies in the world, and we have a significant pipeline to deliver additional POCs, which will convert into annually recurring revenue in the future. And so really our mission and what we believe for the vision for the future is that we believe in the future 2030, 2040, every single corporate will be using net zero materials enabled by Materials Nexus. And thank you for listening. Happy to take any questions.
Awesome. Thanks for the pitch, Jonathan. The first quick question I had for you, you mentioned that IP was part of your strategy, and the more projects that you did, the more IP you would accrue. Are you doing these as are corporations contracting out with you and then you get to keep the IP?
So there's of course a number of different models which we could pursue. So one is that we could just sell part of the software platform to the corporates, which would enable them to gain access to the technology we developed. And the other is to work in partnership with other corporates, which will essentially enable a kind of joint development of IP. And so this is the kind of section I'm talking about. And the reason why we can do that is because, as you're sort of rightly hinting, is that some corporates would like ownership of their IP, which is perfectly acceptable in our business. It's just that we, for particular corporates, they're not interested at all in the IP. So say if you're a large distribution company or a large kind of publishing house, what you're interested in is the result rather than the IP which is generated from the contract. And so that's how we can balance the two sides of the equation.
When you're dealing with corporates, there's usually a lot of hand-holding and customization that goes into each project. How do you foresee scaling something like this?
So we only take on projects which are, in terms of the IP generation, which generated a significant amount of revenue from that particular project. So we will not do a small number of projects because there's not significant revenue generating potential for those things. In the case where there is a lot of customization, we will essentially rent the platform to corporates and they will use that internally as a kind of software as a service platform to enable them to do the things they would like to do.
Awesome, thanks. You guys, other questions for Jonathan?
Yes, I do have a question. Thank you, Jonathan. I enjoyed listening to you. Maybe just to make this whole thing a bit more tangible, could you just explain, maybe using one specific example, what actually happens? I mean, what's the data input, what's the data output, and how does this translate to the real world?
Sure, so I can talk about the government project. So we awarded funding from the Department for Transport, and the aim of that particular project is to develop a new material which enables you to have reduced friction between one surface and another. And although it's not our ambition necessarily to form this into a commercial project, it's kind of a demonstrator, a showcase, kind of marketing, as it were, to kind of show people the power of what we're doing. So the input basically is what is the materials which go into the particular coating, and then the output is essentially the performance. So how non-stick is it to a particular surface? And so, you know, it's for example, you might have a surface which is silicon dioxide. You might have other complicated surfaces like octyl groups on top of those surfaces. So it's the materials chemistry which goes into the input, and then the output is the performance of that that particular coating in application.
Okay, so the corporate, they'll give you the composition of the material, and then what you do is you model how this material acts under different scenarios, and what happens then? Do you give recommendations on how to change it? Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. So we can change the formulations and what are the different inputs, and then directly correlate those to the outputs, and then this can then potentially be patented.
And what other data inputs flow into your modeling?
So those are the only data inputs.
That's
but
it?
I guess there's a lot of know-how associated with how we actually use that data and perform these machine learning and modeling pipelines.
Okay.
And so, you know, this is the culmination of about 5 years of mine and my previous PhD students' work.
Cool. Thank you.
I can go next. Hey, thanks for the pitch. Sven, thanks for the question. That was my first question, actually. I wanted to understand exactly what this does. How spot on is this stuff? Is it 100% sure every time you do, every time a test is done through your platform? So how accurate you know it is, and how can you know that? How do you evaluate that accuracy?
Yeah, sure. So it does depend on the property you're trying to measure, but I had a conversation with an engineer who uses the kind of traditional approaches of these things, and they usually say they get about 60% of the way there in terms of their sort of prediction of what they think happens. And we actually believe we can get to sort of 90-95% of the way there. So, typical error that we would find might be kind of 5% of that order for most properties. But really, the error is maybe not the thing that's kind of the limiting factor. The limiting factor is what's the delta between different compositions. And so even if the error is wrong, that delta is a thing that's going to be significantly more accuracy. And so it might be 0.1%, something like that. So even if we're not bang on the actual property prediction, we'll be bang on and say, actually, that one's going to perform better than that one. And so that's the thing that you can use to drive the process.
Okay, that makes sense. Just another one. What's your go-to-market strategy? Do you have any specific industries that you're targeting? What's the plan here?
So we've had a number of discussions with many different types of corporates, and I think there's many markets which this has application. We think the most near-term one is around the sort of chemicals industry. So think big companies which are producing catalysts, or large companies which are producing volumes of particular chemicals in the US, think like Dow Chemical, things like this. Then there's also a market in automotive and aerospace.
Thanks.
Can you give me a feeling or some information to understand kind of the velocity that's possible here? So for example, just even making the sale to one of the partners that might be using it, and then in their actual sort of time to value and time to market?
So it's pretty typical in terms of getting to sort of yes, between 2 and 3 months kind of time from initial discussion. Then evaluation period might be something like 3 months, but you could probably make it shorter, maybe 2 months. And then, so that's sort of time to value. And then after that, you can essentially license the software to the customer. So, it's reasonably quick within a year. If you're doing more on the IP development, our prediction is 2 years to get towards revenue, and then it ramp after that. But given the markets which we're targeting, every single one is over 10 billion in size. And so, it's sort of worthwhile the investment in terms of the weight, while in the meantime, we're kind of building up the SaaS side of things.
Do we have time for another question?
Go for it, Sven.
Cool. I'd love to get your take on the impact side of things. Because you mentioned, you recommend changes or you sort of model different scenarios. Out of the changes that the corporates then make to their materials, have you ever looked at how this translates to, I don't know, reduction of materials used, or reduction of CO2 footprint or water usage, any sort of impact KPIs?
Yes, so one of the projects which we did on the lead up to sort of spinning out the company was to make an assessment on something like the effect of electric vehicles to the market on the copper supply chain. And so when you look at that, what you realize is that, of course, electric vehicles have a benefit in the fact they're not emitting CO2, but they have a deficit in the fact that there's increased copper usage. And so actually what you can do as a kind of first pass is just make an assessment as to where the most impact comes from in a particular product. So in a car, it is because of the CO2 emissions. That's by far the biggest contribution. In a building, it's going to be mostly the steel and concrete which go into the construction. And so once you've isolated what is the main contribution towards CO2, you can understand then what the impact is going to be. But I think sort of where you're going is exactly where we're going, is that we're also planning on automating all that process in order to understand impacts of particular different elements from certain areas in the world to minimize that impact. But in most cases, it's not a significant contribution. It's more of a fringe contribution.